verse tonight, chapter 7 and verse 25. They took 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb, and they slew Oreb on the rock of Oreb, and Zeeb they slew at the winepress of Zeeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side Jordan. That's the way this story ends. But we got to go back to where we left off. You remember, we're back in Judges, first of all, chapter 7, verses 13 through 15. But even before that, just to remind you again a little bit about the outline, the Judges, of course, Gideon, the children of Israel are the same folks every time. Of course, a new generation, but it's the cycle of sin. The fact that they fall away from the Lord, they begin to involve themselves in idolatry. God sends them an oppressor. They cry unto the Lord. Sometimes it takes them a lot longer to cry than other times. And then God sends them a deliverer. That oppressor in this particular case are the Midianites. We've already talked about them. But they're joined by the Amalekites and also by the children of the east. The chronology is there were 7 years of oppression. But in this case, the oppression is that they sweep in every year during the harvest. During the barley harvest. That's what it is. Well, they have probably other harvests as well, because they know if there's any wheat that's there, they're stealing that first. And of course, the chronology, we said it's 7 and 40, and then the application, we'll get into that more tonight. And when we look at this, we've already talked, like I said, through chapter 6 on the cycle of sin, the call of Gideon, the casting down, that was the removing of the grove of Baal as well as the altar of Baal, and then the clippings of wool, that's the fleece that we looked at last time. And then we also looked at the sifting of Gideon's armies, where we kind of left off. We really didn't finish in that particular stage. If you remember, after the Lord has sifted his army from 32,000, he let 31,700 of them go. And God told him at the end that by 300 men, the 300 that were left, the ones that lapped water, he said, with these will I save you. And then that same night, the Lord told Gideon to get going. And he also told him, I want to remind you of that, Gideon, if you have any fear, I want you to go down to the host of the Midianites with your servant Puah. And so he was instructed to go down to the Midianites. And there was some fear. He went to Puah, and he told them he wanted them to hear what they say. And he says, after you hear them afterwards, thy hands shall be strengthened to go down into the host. That host and their camel, if you remember, were like the locust. Called them as the sand of the sea without number. The sight was intimidating. That's why when we get into this first, well, we're not even going to really look at the chapter 8 and what's coming up. We'll get right past that and get into just a reminder of verse 12. The sight was intimidating. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the children of the east lay along the valley like grasshoppers for multitude, and their camels were without number as the sand of the sea side for multitude. Get that picture so that you've got that, because that's going to be your scene basically for the whole night. And then what happens? It says, when Gideon was come. So as he and Puah maneuver their way down to the host of the Midianite camp, no doubt there were guards set up around their perimeter, and he was able, along with his servant, to slink down in there. And it says, when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow, and said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and that's probably meaning the primary tent of the leaders, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it that the tent lay along. A Midianite warrior, a guard for the enemy, had a dream and was sharing it just by chance, right? Where good old Gideon was hiding out. And Gideon heard something quite interesting. Such a strange dream about a cake of barley bread and how it brought destruction to the host of Midian. And I doubt very much where he knew all of this already. I'm sure he wondered, what in the world did all this mean? Now, before we started, for the sake of those who were on camera, you missed out tonight. We have barley cakes. Well, we're trying them out. Your sister Jackson made them for us. Chris did a great job, and thank you for that. I wanted something here with that. But let's go a little bit further into this. He has this dream, right, and he explains it. And his fellow answered and said, "This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the hosts. This is a Midianite guard." He got a dream, and this is spreading through the camp. I want you to think about that. And it was so, verse 15, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshiped. I bet he did. It humbled his heart, it bowed his head, and he worshiped the Lord. And then he returned to the host, into the host of Israel, and encouraged and excited. I can imagine in his voice, he said, "Arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian." Now, God had already given his word of victory to those 300 men. 300 against 135,000 Midianites. God had spoken clearly to Gideon, and Gideon had already received confirmation through miraculous signs, and I think many signs. Now, all of a sudden, Gideon hears the telling of this dream, and then the interpretation, and again, he has confirmation of God's providential hand coming out of the mouth of the very enemy he's going to defeat. Now he's so confident that he speaks to his men and he tells them that victory is in your hands. God has given it to you. Now it's time to get up and let's go take it. Let's get ready. Let's go. Let's let God use us to win the victory. Now, the cake of barley is not baked like wheat flour. It's not given the time to rise. That's why if you see it, ours are biscuit size. Usually they're made over a stone, a hot stone that's there. But they are usually round and kind of flat. And that's why you can just kind of get the idea of almost like a disc coming down the hill and being blown into the camp. It was the common man's bread. It was the poor man's bread. Again, this more like a biscuit than a loaf of bread. Oftentimes, too, barley bread was used to even feed animals as well as themselves. It was Israel's bread, and it was the harvest that these men, these marauders, came to steal. This bread of Israel doesn't need to be kneaded, doesn't need to be given much time to rise. Again, usually cooked over coals. And this dream pictures a hot cake, basically, rolling, because it's round and dense, coming off those hot coals, and it went right into the joint tents of the Midianites and into the major tent I think of the leaders, the generals that were there, and that tent, which was the best of them all. You know, it had to be tied down. It had to have the guards. They weren't going to let the wind blow that thing around. It was the one that held their military leadership. And what happened to it? It was turned over and inside out and upside down. In other words, there's no repairing of that tent, and that man was right. This is the destruction of the host of Midian. Gideon heard this, and it excited his faith, and those words conquered his fear. To hear the enemy say, and I think he said it with fear in his heart, that this was none other than the sword of the Gideon, the son. Where did he get all that information from? God had given this man words to say whether he knew it was from God or not, and it gave a lot of faith to Gideon. They had heard, these Midianites had now heard and now fear a man they did not know his name until this dream was being populated through their numbers. Gideon's no leader. Gideon's no king. Gideon isn't known to all these men. In fact, where do you remember finding Gideon was hiding in a winepress? Thou mighty man of valor. It's almost like it was sarcastically said, but it was the truth. But listen, now they fear Gideon and his sword. You see, the power of God is mighty to the pulling down of strongholds. What do we see next? We go to the trumpets, the pitchers, and the plan. Now you are going to learn the secret of great military devised plans. For those raised up in church, Sunday school, VBS, summer camps, you've probably heard the story of Gideon many, many times. We've learned that God whittled down the army from 32,000 down to 300. And now Gideon is going to divide them into 3 groups of 100 each. And he provides them with a plan and equipment to battle the enemy. And what does he give him? He divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. Now, it's a metaphor, of course, for something, just like the barley was a metaphor. We've heard about that particular dream. He knows that the metaphor compared Israel's host to the lowly barley cake. This was no grand baking bread. You know, if you've ever been on a cruise ship or in some master chef where they bake great breads, they usually will make all kinds of animals. They have the bread in all kinds of shapes and baked beautiful. This wasn't that kind. It wasn't a tank baked piece of bread, just a barley cake. And it simply rolled down the hill. Maybe blown by the wind, the cake was at the will of another. It was at the will of God. And as uplifting as the news of those guards was when Gideon heard this story, it was seeing or hearing the words, the sword of Gideon. He was humbled by that truth. Remember what his first action was when he heard it. He worshiped. He humbled himself before God. His instructions, I think, had to have come from God, because no one is going to come up with this idea. His instructions to equip them with trumpets and empty pitchers and a lamp within those pitchers. And then what does he do? Verse 17, and he said, "Look on me and do likewise." In other words, follow what I do. "And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, so shall ye do." What they're going to do is they're going to fan out around the perimeter of that Midianite camp. whether they were surrounded completely, but it sounded like they were around them. And you have to think a little bit again around the perimeter of them, where every man was a picture, a lamp, right, underneath that, and a trumpet. So as Gideon acts, everybody's not going to act in unison. It's going to take a while for it to get down. It's going to take a while. So it's kind of like the waves. And if you can think about that all happening and what it would take place, they surround him quietly and in order to a designated place, and each man in his place had a particular duty. He was to be on his watch. He was to follow his leader's actions. He was to be ready to act at a moment's notice. And again, I believe these were orders that God had given to Gideon. Verse 18, when I blow a trumpet, with a trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side. That's why I think it was all around the perimeter of the camp. And say, don't say the sword of Gideon. Remember, that's what the dream guy said. This is no other than the sword of Gideon. Gideon says, no, this is the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. This is the Lord's sword. As God leads me, he's telling his men, you follow me. He called on them to sound the alarm. Again, if you remember that a lot of times when you have an army, however large your squadron may be, however large your section may be, they only usually had one trumpet and one person who would light a light or a signal. So it seems to the Midianites that there's a whole squadron, a whole group of men behind each one of those lights and behind each one of those voices, all screaming out about the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Uh-oh, we just heard that name. We heard a guy dream a dream, and he said that Gideon, that's the sword of Gideon, and he's going to destroy all the host of Midian. They're being woke up just after they've fallen asleep. Some have said it may be, 10 o'clock at night, midnight, somewhere in there. So they're all asleep, and the alarm sounds. The same phrase is being used, and all of these things are shaking the Midianites. Let's look at the subduing of the Midianites from here to the end of the chapter. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch, and they had but newly set the watch. So again, remember, that's that transition point. Always a little confusion at the change of the watch. And they blew the trumpets and brake the pictures that were in their hands. And the three companies blew the trumpets and brake the pictures and held their lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hand to blow withal. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. All of a sudden, the glow of the lamps are all around. The Midianites see they're surrounded. And they can't imagine that only 300 men are attacking them. They're thinking that hordes upon hordes are coming in to attack them. They're shocked. They're confused. And what else do we read? Verse 21, and they stood every man in his place round about the camp. And all the host ran and cried and fled. It's really important to notice, Israel did not move. They stood in their place. Chaos is going on. Now, you know, again, remember, there's only 300 of them. 135,000 men. Probably 200,000 to 300,000 camels. When you think of some who rode upon them, their supplies that were on them. So there was more than they could count. And all of a sudden, chaos is in that camp. It gets bad. They followed orders. They watched the enemy break ranks. They watched them cry, and they watched them run to hide. Confusion ran rampant in the enemy camp. Fear struck at the heart of every Midianite. The dream that they had heard about is now coming true. The host of Israel, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, they are thinking is beginning to wipe us out. Verse 22, and 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow. There was such confusion. There was such chaos, they began to kill one another. Imagine you're ready to fight, but you're not having to do a thing. You're watching them kill each other. Even throughout all the host, imagine Midianites against the Amalekites against the children of the east. They don't know what they're doing, and the host fled to Bethsheba in Zererath and to the border of Abimahalah unto Tabbath. Chaos and fear reigned supreme, so much so that we'll learn later that 120,000 men were killed in this battle. Those 300 trumpets sounded like 300 squadrons or thousands upon thousands. C.H. Spurgeon, in speaking about this event, said this is exactly what Christians need to do. We need to blow the trumpet and break the clay vessel so that our light may shine among men. We ought not to hide our light under a bushel. Blowing that trumpet is preaching the gospel. It is acknowledging that it is the sword of the Lord that you and I bring into the battle, and we will see him work. But these men, again, didn't just stand there fully and only. They never moved, but they saw an opportunity. Look at verse 23. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, out of Asher, and out of all Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. The fears of the Midianites now seem to be gone. This name, Elohim, the God of Gideon, and Gideon, his name, are now fanning the flames of a disturbed and erratic group who are killing themselves. But now Israel is stepping up, and Gideon and his men call for now the others that had been dismissed, and they're calling for them to come in and help finish off the battle. The sequence of the dream and the actual noise of the trumpets, the shouts of Gideon's name, and then the lanterns all shining across the valley, and now the swords of Israel are coming in and conquering. And verse 24, and Gideon sent messengers throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and take before them the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. Listen, they weren't just winning the battle. They were making sure that they were blocking every possible escape route so that the enemy could be totally eliminated. I will only say that you and I cannot leave a smidgen of the flesh alive in our life. We must mortify the deeds of the flesh. You can't let any of it live. And then that last verse, we read it at the beginning. They took 2 princes of the Midianites. Not the 300, but Ephraim and some of the others that were there. They took the 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb. And what happens is so miraculous and fantastic that the rock upon which they killed Oreb now is going to be known forever after as the rock of Oreb. And the area where Zeeb is killed is going to be acclimated towards a winepress, and it is going to be called the winepress of Zeeb. and they pursued Midian. But what did they do in both those areas? They took the heads of the enemy off, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. The plan, of course, is very simple: to block off the enemy's escape so they can be completely destroyed. Eliminate them once for all, and that's what we have to do to the flesh. Mortify, therefore, the deeds of the flesh. The deliverance must be complete, just as our salvation is complete, but we must also work out our own salvation. There is a work of sanctification that you and I must be involved in by the power of the Spirit. We are to be sanctified after we have been sanctified. By that I mean we've been sanctified by the Lord, but we are to sanctify ourselves. Sanctification is a putting away of the flesh. It is a crucifying of the flesh plus more. Gideon and his men are teaching us about crucifying the flesh. These men of note that we see them killing Oreb and Zeeb were the leaders of the Midianites. They were captured and their heads brought to Gideon. One of these rocky geographical locations is also noted in Isaiah 10 and 26. And I think it's 9 and 4. I've got it somewhere else in here. Yeah, there it is. And the Lord of hosts shall stir up a scourge for him according to the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. And as his rod was upon the sea, what do you think that's talking about? When Israel crossed the Red Sea? It is. So shall he lift it up after the manner of Egypt. These battles, this battle is so momentous that it is used as a note of encouragement hundreds of years later for all of Israel. That was a request to destroy the Assyrian king and his army, just like God destroyed the Midianites, their leaders, and made their escape impossible. It's the same encouragement of us to destroy them by God's power. Both Midianite princes are mentioned again also in Psalm 89. This is where Asaph asked God to wipe out their enemies, and later in that whole psalm, it's a short one, you can read it later, but it says out of their enemies, he asked for their destruction to be like, make it like the nobles like Oreb and Zeeb. Do unto them as unto the Midianites. Wipe them out, God. That's what they're asking for. In other words, God, you need to act. Again, this is an act of God so well noted that we teach our children that story, and they taught their children that story. The deliverer is Gideon, but the power is God's, and you can see it all through here. Many have noted the meaning of the names of these two princes of Midian. Oreb is known as the raven. Zeeb is known as the wolf. Both animals are basically scavengers, killers. And in fact, wolves will kill for the thrill, not just for the food. Let's look, as we close out, the applicable spiritual lessons. I want to say just a few things. Number one, when your faith is challenged, do not despair. When your doubt arises in your heart and denies faith a resting place, take it to the Lord. God may not give you signs the same as he gave to Gideon, but God will not deny you because of doubt. Doubt isn't always distrust. Remember, there's a fellow by the name of Thomas the doubter? And God cured his doubt, didn't he? And he can with us. In fact, I will tell you, when I began to think more about this, God gave Gideon more signs than people count. We know the obvious signs, but let me give you a list of some of them. And you and I need to look for the providential signs of God, and you will find them. God gave Gideon, like I said, more signs than most people count. First of all, he gave him the sign of an angel appearing to him and telling him, thou mighty man of valor. That's a pretty good sign, don't you think? God gave him a sign of the Midianite guard and the dream of the barley cake and the fact that his name is mentioned by these Midianites. How do they even know who I am? That's a sign. Of course, before that, we know that God had given him a sign of the dew on the fleece, not on the ground, and then on the ground and not on the fleece. And of course, he would certainly consider the after effect of using only 300 men to defeat 135,000. That's a sign. When God gave him the sign of a miraculous battle right in front of his eyes of seeing the self-destruction of the enemy. That's an obvious sign, isn't it? You know what it is for us to help us, instead of like I used to do, Lord, make a red Volkswagen bus go by. Just look for God's message in the most unlikely places. Gideon heard it from the mouth of the enemy. He was encouraged, and when that happened, he fell on his face and worshiped. He humbled himself before the Lord and looked to honor him first. Victory, we must remember, comes from the Lord. He initiates it, and then when we follow his leadership, we can claim its power and be involved. Trust in God's provision. Trust in God's power. Even when Gideon was fearful. Remember, people will say, oh, the first group of people were wiped out because they're terrible. They're fearful. Well, what do we learn later? Gideon was fearful. How did God deal with it? He gave him a friend to help him. God will give you someone to help you. And God will always provide a way of escape. Whenever our faith is tested, whenever we are in trial, 1 Corinthians 10 and 13 says God is faithful, who will provide a way. In fact, that's not the way of escape. Every step of this story is filled with the providential hand of God, which is again another sign from God. How is it that you can walk down to hide at the enemy, hide before the enemy, near the guards, and all of a sudden 2 guards come up and just start talking about this story, just perchance? We too have the sword of the Lord. And we can be the Gideon, the man that God will use. Gideon was found hiding. At that time, quite shocking to say he was a man of valor. But by the end of this story, I think you can see, like I do, a very brave soul, a mighty man of valor. What this tells me is God uses feeble means to accomplish his goals. He uses feeble people. This makes us all the more a trophy of God's grace rather than a monument to our abilities and our talents. Gideon, the reason why he was successful is because he was called. The call qualified him. If God calls you, you too are qualified. Gideon may have been fearful, and certainly he was a faulty man, but he kept on seeking God's confirmation and information. Gideon never ceased to pray. Every time when he's looking, and we say, well, you know, he's looking for a sign, but who's he talking to? He's talking to God. He's praying. Gideon was obedient to his call. From destroying the grove and the altar of Baal, to slipping down into the enemy's camp, to instructing his men to follow the plan, and then claiming victory by the sword of the Lord. I'll give you one other set of, to me, profitable lessons. I call these Charles Simeon's nothings. I call him that. He didn't call him that, but it's because he made 4 great points about nothing. Here they are. Undertake nothing in your own strength. Number 2, draw back from nothing to which you have been called. Number 3, doubt nothing which God has promised. And lastly, take glory in nothing which God has done by us. I think those are some good nothings. Good nothings for us to learn from. I pray that's been a blessing to you tonight. I went along a little bit longer, and again, thank you, Kristen, for